So welcome everyone. My name is Dora. I'm one of the organizers of Qesher, and thank you for everyone who is joining us regularly. And it's very, very nice to see you and have you all here today. And also, if you're joining us for the first time, we want to give you a very warm welcome and thank you for joining us. Our aim, together with Sebastian, who is we are the co-founders of Qesher, is to introduce Jewish communities from all over the world. And from our regular Zoom sessions, another series grew out, which is the Qesher Book Club, because we realized that there are so many interesting books in the topic of Jewish life around the world that now about twice a month we introduce a different author and a different book that they have written on a topic that we find interesting and we think that it's very relevant for Qesher and for everyone. So today, as now you already heard from the beginning in the discussion, we're going to discuss a very special topic that we've never discussed before, because we did have talks about the Abba Yudaya community of Uganda, but we never had a talk about the European Jews who used to live in Uganda, and this is what we're going to speak about. We are very happy to welcome Janice Masur, who is the author of Shalom Uganda, and she wrote about her own experience and her own community, which existed around in the 20th century in Uganda. She will share the smaller details, of course. So now I'm going to pass the word to Janice, and let's hear about Shalom Uganda.
Hello, everybody. Special thanks to Dora and Sebastian for inviting me. I've never presented to an organization which comes from Europe. So this is a first for me. And thank you all for coming. I wanted just to show you the cover of the book, because this is a book club. And I don't know how you feel, but when I pick up a book in the library or wherever, the cover has to give me a hug. It has to make me feel interested. It has to make me feel curious. And I hope that this cover for you individually makes you interested. Not that you need to read the book, but just that it's a pleasant, inviting cover. So how come that I even bothered to write about this? Here in Vancouver, Canada, where I live, not anymore, but in 2005, one could go back to university as a senior for free. And that's what I did. And I always try to make the topic something relevant to Jews. I couldn't find anything, and I was ready to change my topic. And my professor said, no, you carry on. So from 3 tiny little thin books with a paragraph and barely a sentence about Uganda Jews, meaning Ashkenazi European Jews, came this book and a project that I will tell you about. And it's not a fundraiser, so you can relax. Next slide. So this is a slide of my mother, and it's taken in 1936. And on the back of the photograph, she says, "Would you like a warship?" Now, if we were in a group and one-on-one, and I could actually interact with you, I would ask you to guess. So perhaps individually, quietly yourselves, you might like to try and imagine where this could be. It's actually Haifa in 1936. My mother has just finished playing tennis. She is British. She left London, England in 1935, 1936, because as a young Jewish woman trained with the esteemed Pittman's stenography group, she had to leave the job with a lawyer, very prestigious firm in London, because she was Jewish. So she broke her engagement and took a steamer ship to Palestine, as it was then called. This is where she met my father. They courted on the top of the Carmel, and some of you may know that there were anemones at that time on the top of the Carmel, and they got married. Next slide. And so the thing was that Rommel, the general of the German general, was coming across the top of Africa. And actually, my uncle was a prisoner of war in the desert. But he was coming across in sort of like a pincer movement across the top of Africa. And my father, who was a survivor from the Holocaust, somehow he'd managed to get to Palestine, was anxious. He thought that perhaps he might be caught again. So they decided to come to Eritrea, which is just right here. And that was in 1942. Now, in 1942, the British were arriving in Eritrea, which had been an Italian colony since the 1890s. There was an Adonite Jewish community in Asmara where my parents landed. Because in the 1880s and 1890s, here in Yemen, as some of you might know, it wasn't so nice for Jews. And so they came across to Masur on the coast and then came up to Asmara. So when my parents were there were Italian Jews, 500 in the community, and there was a cemetery in Kampala, beautifully kept by the community. Now only one man, Sammy Cohen. And there was a cemetery in Keren with Italian Jews who had lost their lives fighting the British. So next slide. So this is just the inside of the synagogue. The men built it in 1912. And it's just a sweetheart, all the different chandeliers, the stained glass. The women did the Torah covers, and there's a delightful little gallery for the women. So my parents were on the edge of that Adonite Sephardic Jewish community, being Ashkenazi. As you know, there wasn't too much intermingling. So when it was time for me to be weaned from breastfeeding, instead of asking the grandmas and aunts in this community, my mother wrote a letter to her father-in-law in Wales. That's another story about evacuees and saving Jews. To ask how to wean me from breastfeeding. Next slide. So here I am at age about 4, most probably, and I had many pets. Mike, who was a wonderful dog, he escorted me to school, and a Bambi, who had come to us as a baby because its mother had been shot. So I had a funny sort of a life, as you can see. Next slide. So in 1949, the Americans who were in Eritrea and the British who were in Eritrea were beginning to leave, and it was time for my family to leave as well. So my mother and I went to England for 9 months, and my father came all the way around like this. Can you see the cursor? Maybe not. Anyway, they came around the Horn of Africa down to a little place called Mombasa, and he took the train to Nairobi. Now, some of you might have been in Nairobi. Thank you. But Nairobi in 1903 had already 3 Jews, if you can imagine. 3 Jews. By 1912, there were enough Jews to build the first synagogue in Nairobi. But my father, when he came in 1949, didn't have the money to stay in Nairobi or in Kenya because there was what was called a head tax, which was 50 English pounds, an incredible amount of money in that time. And so even though he managed to find a Jew who gave him a job in Uganda, he had to travel to Uganda. Uganda was sort of for the Jews who weren't farming, so they weren't taken off the train and made managers of Jewish farms in Kenya. They were for people who couldn't afford. So there's my father, and he has a job as manager of a tile and brickwork factory 8 miles out on the Hoima Road. So 8 miles out of Kampala, which became a little town in 1949, in the jungle or temperate forest. And when I was there just now in March, there's no forest there anymore. It's all built up. Anyway, Next slide. So here we are now in Uganda. And this is my mother on the equator, because the Jewish community to where I belonged was on the equator. And that's it. Next slide. So this picture here, this painting, actually, it's an oil painting, is by Kay Lipton, and it's on the back of my book. In the background here are the Mountains of the Moon, or the Ruwenzori Mountains, as you might like to call them nowadays. And when I was there in March of 2024, I'll tell you why in a few minutes, I never saw any Ugandan person in national dress, nothing like this. If you notice, they have no shoes. I didn't see a Ugandan barefoot, not one. And they were wearing European clothing. One of the many changes for the better. My daughter treated me to an airplane ride from one place to another. And the pilots were Ugandan. And my heart was so happy, because when I lived there, that could never have been. Next slide. So this is what Kampala looked like when I lived there. This was painted by a friend of ours. And in those days, Kampala was built on 7 hills on the shores of Lake Victoria. And on each hill was a place of religion. So this is a mosque. There was the Baha'i Temple, number 3 in the world. There was the Nararembe Cathedral and the Catholic Cathedral. So Protestant and Catholic, Muslim also, but nothing for the Jews. We had no synagogue, we had no rabbi, no Torah, just 23 families. Next slide. So this is the Kabuli Mosque close up in that time. And I went to have a look when I was there just now, expecting to find, to me, this is a very lovely building. Next slide. And this is what we saw. It looked to me like a fortress, none to be worshipped but Allah, Muhammad, his prophet. Ironically, though, there doesn't seem to be any anti-Semitism in Uganda, or there wasn't when I was there in March, because our Abadaya driver arrived at the airport wearing a yarmulke, and when we got to his sort of slightly rundown car, he had an Israeli flag between the 2 front seats, which we managed to get rid of because we thought if there was an accident, for sure we would lose an eye. It felt very funny to us to sort of be able to tout our Jewishness, but we got used to it. So in this photograph here, Qesher about 1957 or thereabouts, because I lived in Uganda from 1949 until 1961 with my family. This is the whole of the Jewish community. We fit basically into one room at the Speak Hotel, where sometimes some of the high holidays would be held. Once it was in a school, several times in my parents' home, and on occasion here. So this is Kay Lipton, who painted the oil painting you just saw. This is Ilse Dockelman, who gifted me this photograph when I was in London, and together with 2 of her children, we managed to name every single person in this photograph. So historically and for research purposes, this is a very important photograph. We had only about 60 boxes of matzah per year, whereas in Nairobi, they had over 1,000 boxes of matzah, which came from South Africa and/or Israel. Now, this is the visit from Chief Justice Herbstein in 1958. And this is in my parents' home. And if you can imagine 23 families, and he was on a United Jewish Appeal, and everybody donated something out of their meager pay. This is my mother, my father, my aunt, my uncle, a couple from Cochin, East Indian, and Ilse Dockelman. And this person, this woman, I'm sorry to say, nobody knows her name. So it was a very Freilich affair, my mother says, with white tablecloths and candlesticks, and they borrowed a houseboy. That's what the servant or the person who worked for one was called. I might be using apolitical language just to give a feel of the era, so you will excuse me, I hope. So the houseboy was loaned for the evening because our houseboy couldn't cope with the event. Next slide. So we were secular. We couldn't do anything. We didn't have a Heder. We didn't have anything, but we knew we were Jewish and we celebrated everything that we possibly could. And we were British as well. So here then is a man called Sir Andrew Cohen. And again, if it was a more intimate book club, I would ask if you know anything about Sir Andrew Cohen. This is my cousin who beat me to it and is reading the proclamation Sir Andrew Cohen is holding on this Youth Day in 1956. And you can see a Ugandan nurse and a scout who's East Indian. So Sir Andrew Cohen was the governor of Uganda, and he was Jewish. And he was the very first governor of Uganda not to plunder the country, either with taking ivory or in minerals or whatever, for his own personal benefit. So that's huge. He also was very involved in education. He felt that this was the key to independence. On the other side of the coin, he made the king, King Freddie, the Kabaka of Uganda, he put him in exile because he didn't want to be a puppet king. And so if you read up about Sir Andrew Cohen, you will see some people are very negative about him and some people are very positive about him. He had 2 children. They were twins, girls, and I played with them at Government House. So when I was there in Entebbe just now, which is where Government House is, because Entebbe used to be the government center and Kampala the commercial center of Uganda, I was amazed to see the changes also in that area around Government House. Next slide. Is this of interest? You're following me, and because it's evening for you, many of you. You're with me, yes? If I could see you all, I would be able to tell by your faces and your body language, but I can't do that today. So this is Ruth Leviton and myself at we were bridesmaids at a wedding. How many weddings do you imagine that we had? From 1949 until 1964, actually, slightly after my family left, there were only 4 weddings. This particular wedding was to a man called Steve Pullman, who was a Holocaust survivor, and he was marrying a non-Jewish woman, and there was no rabbi available. Ruth Leviton has always been a most gorgeous looking woman, I have to tell you. And her grandfather is very important, Moshe Leviton, because when I was doing my research, I can't tell you my excitement when I discovered that Ruth's grandfather, Moshe, was the man who had actually helped and encouraged Chief Kakungulu to become Jewish. Now, going back in time to the 1890s, late 1890s, when the railway line was being built from the coast into Uganda, there might have been some Jewish engineers. There was a Jewish man who walked from the coast, if you can imagine, all the way into Uganda and established a trading center. But Phil Leviton became friendly as a trader, as another trader, with Kakungulu. He was a member of the Lungfish tribe, and his tribe had been in Uganda for many, many years. When the British came, he helped the British secure Uganda for Britain, because as you might know, there was a scramble in Africa. The Germans, the Belgians, the British, the French, all had a bit of Africa. So Chief Kakungulu became very disillusioned when he found that the British weren't really very interested in making him a king. And in fact, what they did was they gave him about 20 square miles sort of up in the Bundu. Bundu is a Swahili word. And now the language is Uganda, the language of independence. But in my day, it was Swahili. The Bundu means in the middle of nowhere, 20 square miles, and said, you can govern that. And he didn't like the British. He didn't like their medication. He didn't like their governing of the country. So he was there. He divorced his wife because she wouldn't become Jewish, and he started the Abadiyah. So that was up until 1921 when the Abadiyah officially became a group of people. Next slide. So there were people who came to Uganda privately, as some people did, or my father, who became independently employed, first of all, as I mentioned, at the tile and brickwork factory, and then as a car salesperson. Nothing very illustrious, because his engineering education had been interrupted because of the Second World War and his fleeing. So this is my uncle, Maury, who is buried in the Jewish cemetery. And as you know, the cemetery is always attached to a Christian cemetery with some kind of fencing or hedge around it. Mm-hmm. So this was 1957. Next slide. And this is also a rather important picture. Why? This is my Uncle Maury, my cousin again, and his little sister. I always wanted a sibling and never got one. Anyway, and this is me looking very unhappy. I'm going to a Girl Guide camp in a place called Qesher. And again, if we were in a small group, I would say, has anyone heard about Qesher? Qesher is very important also because many Jews who were fleeing Poland and Germany landed up in Ukraine and so on, and Poland. And they marched as a group through what was then Persia, India, and what were the British going to do with them when Rommel was coming across the desert? So they brought these people to Uganda, not as a concentration camp, but more as a refugee camp. So there were about 5,000 Poles, mainly, who arrived in Uganda. Among them, about 20 Jews, one of whom was Teresa Franco, who, the story went, had walked alone from Poland to Uganda. And that's what I imagined until I met Teresa in 2005 during my research. And she told me that she hadn't actually walked alone, but had joined this group, landed up in Qesher, in the Qesher camp, and had become a nurse there, and then lived there and married a man called Victor Franco, who will come into the story shortly. So Qesher camp, and I was so surprised because my job, and it's only later I wondered whether it was because I was Jewish, my job as a Girl Guide in this camp was to clean the toilets. And I was thinking, how are there toilets here when we're supposed to be in the Bundu, in the bush, and this is supposed to be a camp for Girl Guides, so we learn all about, camping in the wild. But next slide. So this is a letter from the Commonwealth Jewish Council, which has its headquarters in London, as many of you will know. And essentially what it's saying is that I can confirm that you can't have a Jewish life in Uganda in 1987. And I was very upset by this letter because this letter then excludes the Abadiyah, who last century were trying very hard to survive. Next slide. So this is 2004. And here I am in Uganda with my daughter, and we are a Qesher. Here is their cemetery. About 75 Poles and or others are buried here. And I believe that the camp that I was in would have been off to the right. There's sort of a bay there that you can't see. And the camp where I would have been a girl guide would have been just right there. Next slide. And this is what it says: cemetery for the Polish refugees, former Soviet prisoners in Siberia, resettled to Uganda during World War II. Next slide. Because you see, we have no cemetery anymore in Uganda. It is built over with a luxury apartment building. And when I told people that there was a cemetery underneath there and that there had been Jews, European Ashkenazi Jews there, to Ugandan people, they were very surprised. And some were really upset that there had been a building placed on top of a cemetery. So that's really the essence of my project, because there was no Jewish cemetery, there was no more Jewish community. Yes, there are Jews who come to Uganda. They might be American, they might be Israeli, they might be any other grouping, but generally speaking, they don't stay. They are sojourners, the same as we were. They're there to do something, either permanently for 5 years, 6 years, maybe 10 years or longer as we were, or they finish the project and they leave. Maybe they come back and continue another project. But there still is not, or wasn't until very recently, a synagogue in Kampala. I went to the synagogue. It's tent in the Chabad rabbi's garden. And there was the rabbi, 3 Israeli soldiers, one Israeli man who lives in Uganda and Kampala, and myself in the synagogue. Hasn't changed very much. Okay, I diverged. So this is Victor Franco, who married Teresa Franco, who I just told you about. Now, he is important. He is a Jew born in Egypt and left with his family. And why is he important? Because in last century, I'm sorry, that doorbell just rang, and I'm just wondering, I'm hoping someone's going to answer it. Excuse me. So Victor Franco is important because together with Phil Leviton, the son of Moshe Leviton, and maybe 1 or 2 other people, actually went and visited the Abadiyah, brought them paper, brought them books that they could study from, and helped them financially. Now, when I was doing my research and I asked various people who had lived in Kampala at that time, who would have been slightly older than myself, because remember, I was a child at that time, they had no idea of the Abadiyah. Who's the Abadiyah? One of the people said to me. So Victor Franco is important from that point of view. He's also important because he tried to start a Jewish Sunday school, which was impossible because we were only about 17 Jewish children born in Uganda, maybe a few more who weren't born in Uganda like myself. And we were disparate ages, so there was no way to have a cheder. We tried around the kitchen table or dining room table for 3 weeks, and that's all that we could manage. Next slide. Next slide. Is it possible? Because Victor Franco and Phil Leviton helped the Abadiyah, and then later on, there was more publicity for the Abadiyah. Here we were in Rabbi Gershom Suzumu's area with the Abadiyah. We were there for Shabbat, drumming. Oh, such drumming, such joy on Shabbat. It was absolutely wonderful to be there. And this is Sunday morning, and we all sort of walked from the synagogue down to a flat area where this memorial to my Jewish community was unveiled. And this is Leora, my daughter. And so I had some sort of satisfaction that there was at least one memorial here for my Jewish community. And the next slide. And this is essentially what it says. We're recording the existence of the little known Abadaya Jewish community who were helped by my Jewish community, Phil Leviton, Victor Franco, and the original Kampala Ginger Jewish community can no longer be located. We honor and commemorate those Jews who lived, worked, and are buried in Uganda. Okay, next slide. So while we were there, we went to see the place where the Jews, the Abadaya Jews, had worshipped during the Idi Amin era. As you know, many Jews were killed. There were about 3,000 Abadayas before Idi Amin, and that number was greatly reduced during that era. So if you can imagine, this little piece here is a great big overhanging piece of rock of a cave. And on top of the rock, we climbed up on top of it, are some stones, and they used to bang on the roof of this cave in order to call the Jews to come to worship. So here we are, and this, goodbye, my husband's going to his daycare physio now. Life goes on. Sorry for the interruption. So this man here is the first Igbo Jew I have ever met in my whole life. His name is Avraham, and he is here because there was also at the same time as the unveiling, the rabbi from Nairobi, a young, very full of energy young man, was coming to talk to the Abadaya, sort of like a mini conference. And so that's why he was there. His name is Rabbi Nathaniel, and he is responsible for all of the Jewish communities in East and West Africa. So, you know, there's the Igbo, the Yoruba, the Abadaya, and so on. Another topic. Okay, next slide. And who is this man who looks like a farmer? We met him on the trail going from where we had parked the car to the cave. And he is J.J. Keki, Rabbi J.J. Keki. I don't know if any of you know him. Again, if we were in a small group, it would be so much easier. Now, J.J. Keki is important because in the 1990s, he went to Nairobi with some other people to the synagogue in Nairobi saying, we're Jews, we're doing the best we can, and we would like to know more about being Jewish and so on. And he was shunned by the rabbi of the day. He gave me a big hug and he said, and you know, I kept on going back. We kept on going back until we were allowed in the synagogue. And so that was the beginning of the Abadayas sort of being accepted into the diaspora of Judaism. And I felt very honored to meet him. I thought he had died. I didn't realize he was still alive. So this is a synagogue in Puti Puti. I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, but it is an Orthodox Jewish community, Black. I thought there was just the conservative one with Rabbi Gershom Suzumu, but no, there's the conservative synagogue and compound here, and then dotted around in 3 different villages, plus another one, which is between Entebbe and Kampala, are 3 Orthodox Jewish Black Abadaya communities. And interspersed in between them are Muslim villages. And so when we were with Rabbi Gershom Suzumu, we could hear the call to prayer from the Muslims. And in actual fact, one Muslim woman came and plunked herself down on the sofa in Rabbi Suzumu's sitting room and used to telephone her cell phone because the Wi-Fi was much better than in her village, which I think is quite lovely. Next slide. And this is just another picture of the Orthodox putti area, and very small. This is the rabbi's wife, and she's sitting on the ground together with a helper, and she's preparing vegetables for the dinner. Even in Rabbi Suzuma's home, although it's quite modern, the women do the cooking outside in a courtyard. And Kuleno, through a friend of mine, donated money for a set of extra knives for the kitchen. Okay, next slide. And these are Jewish Black children, Orthodox. Aren't they cute? Aren't they lovely? Next slide. And this is the rabbi's wife, Rabbi Geshomer's wife, and our Abadiah driver, and Ariel, who was instrumental in creating the headstones or the memorials for me. There are actually 2 memorials. We've unveiled one of them. Now, what about the other? And this, for 5 people in Kampala, in a nice restaurant, cost only 70 Canadian dollars for dinner. Next slide. Just to give you an idea. This is Kampala today. You have fencing, you have gates, you have guards with guns, which was the case at the house where where I lived. We tried to get in and the guard wouldn't let us in. But floating down, just as there had been in the 1950s, were little purple flowers, 5 petals, like little propellers. And when I tried to find out the name of it, the picture, as you can on Google, it came up with starfish. And I said, no, 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 that's not what I want at all. Anyway, I could not find my way around Kampala. It has changed so much. It is huge. It is enormous. It is busy, as those of you who have been know, and very different from what I remember. Next slide. So this is the luxury building on top of the Jewish cemetery, the back of it. The front of it is even more elegant, with umbrellas and parking, lots of wall space to put a memorial. I had been trying to get a hold of Dr. Ruparelia for several months, and in Kampala, I managed to get a hold of him in 3 minutes by somebody who had a direct phone number for him. And his reply was, no, nothing. I don't want any memorial anywhere here at all. This here is a Christian cemetery, and as you can see, it's in real disrepair and most probably slated for building very shortly, I imagine. So Leora and I were very despondent about that. I mean, we knew that we couldn't put the memorial stone, but where were we going to put it? In the Chabad garden, perhaps? In a museum, maybe? Where could we put it? Next slide. So this is Rabbi Gershom Suzumu in his garden with the memorial for my Jewish community, the one that I wanted to put somewhere, not possible. It was so hot, but under the tree, it was very cool. And anyway, there you are. I was sad, but happy. This is the realism of life today. And the fact that the Jewish community has died, it's like in the firmament of diaspora Jewishness. Not many people know about my Jewish community. They know about the Abadiah now. And last century, we knew about my community, but not about the Abadiah. Next slide. And this is essentially what it says, the people who died and were buried there, the names of all of the people and what they did. Next slide. So while I was there, my passport was stolen off my lap in a car through an open window. I was there for extra time. I went to the Kitsubi UNESCO site on mile 5 on the Homo Road. I had lived on mile 8. I never knew about it. And this is a painting by a man called Prince Joseph. Next slide. This is the inside of one of the tombs. You can see this is all done with elephant grass. Isn't it ornate? It's beautiful, I think. Another slide. This is a wife of one of the kabakas in this compound. She's 101 years old, and she's the only woman I saw wearing the Buganda national dress. Can you see the puffed sleeves? And it's long. She was an absolute delight. And Prince Joseph introduced me to her because we had something in common. Next slide. Which I think is on the next slide. I showed him this photograph, which Ilse Dockelman gave me. It's dated 1942, I think, or something, I forget. I think it was 1942, 1939, beg your pardon, 1939. This is Ilse Dockelman's parents. They just arrived off the SS Usumbara, the last ship to leave Germany. They had 5 English pounds in their pocket. Again, couldn't stay in Kenya, and here they are. This is a non-Jewish family who had the only farm in Uganda because Europeans could not buy land usually in Uganda. And that's another story as to why not. Here is King Freddie before he became king, and his brother, Edward, Prince Edward. Prince Joseph took the photograph from me on my phone and looked at it and looked at it. And he said, "This is my grandfather." And I was just blown away. Next slide. So this is also an important photograph, which Prince Joseph is very happy to see. What is it? It is the opening of the Bulangi, or the Ugandan government, courtesy of Sir Andrew Cohen, who was the instigator of all of this, together with the British government for independence. And here is myself, my grandmother visiting from Germany. She went back to Germany to live her life, and my mother. Next slide. And this is the Bulangi in March. Next slide. And so Prince Joseph invited Albert Kazuzi, who is the executive director of Heritage and Tourism in Uganda, to my hotel. And we talked about where could we possibly put a memorial for my Jewish community. Well, they suggested perhaps a museum that was now being built. Next slide. And guess what? Here is a drum. It's enormous. Look at the size of it. The shells around it. I would love to hear the sound of it. It is coming from Cambridge University in England. Apparently, many artifacts, so considered, if I use my language carefully, were removed or purchased and were in England and are now being returned to Buganda for the Buganda Museum. And I'm going to have about 6 photographs, pertinent ones for the Jewish community in this museum. So if ever you're visiting Kampala, go to the Buganda Museum and have a look at the photographs. Next slide. And this is my daughter and I on the equator in March. And that's it. Thank you very much. And I hope you really enjoyed it. And I haven't talked a lot about the book, but you could read it if you like.
Thank you so much, Janice. Thank you so much for sharing this very unique and unknown story. And of course, those of you who are interested deeper, you can read more about it in the book, about the history and about the details. So you should, if you're interested, get it. And we will, of course, tomorrow send out a follow-up email in which you will receive the link to the book and also the link to this presentation. So let me just see if there have been any questions, or perhaps Sebastian can help me because I was sharing the slides.
Yes, there were a few questions. First question from Leslie: if there are still any descendants of the European Jews that stay in Uganda, even if there's no community, but some of their descendants.
I think I heard you say there is no community. Could the question be repeated?
Yes, sorry. That if even though there's no like Ashkenazi community anymore, but any of the descendants of these European Jews living in Uganda today?
No, that's a very good question. Thank you. But in Nairobi, they're third generation Jews in Nairobi, but not in Kampala. No. There's one woman in South Africa, 2 or 3, 4 in England, some in London, and one in Thailand, myself in Canada, and somebody in Boulder, Colorado.
Thank you. And someone asked where in Canada do you live exactly?
Vancouver.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you. And a question that came later, but is connected to the first one that I asked. Why did the community leave? What was the reason they?
From my parents' point of view, they knew that Uhuru or independence was coming. They felt that there would be a bloodbath. There wasn't. I mean, there was later with Idi Amin, but with independence in 1962, there was not. And then, of course, when Israel became the state that it is, some people went there as well. But there was sort of like two waves. One was with the Teresa Franco era, and my father, being German refugees or European refugees from the war, and then came from Britain mainly people with government jobs who were there on contract, be they school teachers or post office managers or commercial artists or professors at Macquarie College, whatever.
Thank you. And could you explain again in a bit more detail how your family came from Palestine to Uganda, how they end up in Africa? Apparently it wasn't very clear to us.
First, and then we flew. My mother and I went to England, and for 9 months while my father reconnoitered for a job, and then we flew from London to Entebbe Airport in Uganda. The plane before us crashed. The plane after us crashed, and actually, as you've asked, it was really funny because I remember I was looking out the window and our plane was faster than another plane. And in the porthole of the other plane was a nun wearing her wimple. And she waved at me and I waved back. And I was only 5 years old. So, yeah.
Thank you. And 1 second, because
the next question was what happened to the Ashkenazi synagogue?
What happened to the Ashkenazi
synagogue?
There never was one. There never was one. That was the problem. Many of the high holidays were in my parents' house ad hoc. We didn't have a rabbi, but there would have been 1 or 2 men who knew and understood how services were run and led them. Once we had a rabbi for Yom Kippur, and I had to have breakfast in the bathroom because my parents didn't remember that unless you were 13 or older, or 12 for a girl, you could eat. So that's sort of the level of general knowledge within the community, that we were secular and we were cohesive. If a new child came to school, the teacher would say, you know, there's another Jewish child here, and the parents would get in touch. There was no official welcoming for Jews. They kind of had to flounder a little bit in Kampala, unlike Nairobi, where they had even a cookery book, a Jewish cookery book the women had made. They were very well organized there. So the only synagogue now today is the Chabad one, which is a tent and doesn't often have a minyan.
Thank you. There were many questions about this plan of making a Jewish state in Uganda. Do you know anything about this? I mean, this old plan from early Zionists, and how do you think about that?
In hindsight, somebody said to me the other day, do you think it would have been a better idea for a Jewish community to have been in Uganda looking at what's happening today? Anyway, in 1903, the boundary was moved to the east. Yes, and so what happened was that Kenya got the White Highlands, which had been in Uganda. So that area that was going to be the area for the Jewish settlement would have been in Uganda, and that's why it's called the Uganda settlement. But in actual fact, it was in Uganda, in the highlands of Uganda. Very beautiful. I went to boarding school there because European children couldn't go to secondary school in Uganda. And this was because Lord Chamberlain in 1903 said that the climate in Uganda was so tropical and so heavy and so difficult to breathe, it was unhealthy for children. And so we had to go either to Kenya in the temperate climate, or some children went to England to school. So that is the idea of the settlement. It actually also happened because there was a Jewish surveyor who came to Uganda with a group, with an organization, and he said, there are no Black people here. But he didn't realize that there had been a war between the Kikuyu and the Maasai, and that had decimated the Black population. The same man, when he went to what was Palestine, said, there are not many Arab people here. It is a good place for Jews to settle, the same man. So that's the Uganda settlement.
Thank you. Can you discuss Idi Amin and the Entebbe raid a little bit more in detail?
Okay. I'm not very well up on Idi Amin because that's well past my project and research area. But I can tell you that a lot of East Indian people fled for their lives with nothing. And we here in Vancouver in British Columbia, we have many East Indians from that era, and they are amazing business people and have helped British Columbia be what it is today. As I mentioned, Idi Amin did nothing for the Abadiyah. There were 2 Israeli diplomats who raced for their lives to Nairobi. And when I talked to a man who lived in Nairobi, Charles Schlepek, of blessed memory, he told me that he had no memory at all of diplomats arriving in Nairobi. He was in charge of the Jewish archives in Nairobi, which are now in Israel. And in those archives, there's hardly anything about the Uganda Jewish community. As somebody said to me, well, every time you wrote, it was mainly about asking how many boxes of matzah we could send you. So that's sort of the communication. Kampala was very isolated. It was 350 miles plus away from Nairobi. It was one sleepover in a train going to Nairobi. It was very costly to travel to Nairobi, whether you went by airplane or whether you went by road over muddy roads in the rainy season, or whether you took the train as we did to boarding school.
Thank you. And the Entebbe raid, did you mention? I'm sorry, I was reading the Entebbe raid. Sebastian, can you?
The raid at the Entebbe airport by the Israeli army. Someone asked if you have anything to comment on that.
I do, actually. Thank you for asking. Funnily enough, just before I went to Uganda, I got a call from a woman. I thought it was a scam at first, but she lives in Israel, but she had lived in Uganda, in Entebbe actually, as a child, because as you perhaps know, Israel was very involved in helping Idi Amin with trade and so on, until Idi Amin decided he wanted more fighter jets, and Israel was not willing to provide them. And also Golda Meir came to Uganda after I had left. But She lived in Entebbe, and her father was a pilot. And as you might know, there were Israeli pilots in Uganda. And her father was the only pilot who Idi Amin would trust. And so on the weekends, when Idi Amin didn't need to fly here and there, this was in the good time of Idi Amin, the family was allowed to travel in the plane, private plane, wherever they wanted. And then came the bad time. And as you know, at that time, Ugandans were going to Israel to study, and Israel was showing the Ugandan government how to train Air Force. So Israel was very prominent at that time. Yeah. And ironically, the house where I used to live had an East Indian doctor living in it, who had been the doctor to Idi Amin. So you could say that that's another link, if you like, to history.
Thank you very much. There was a question if people would like to get in touch with you. Is that possible? Can we share your email address?
Yes, with pleasure. And
Okay.
I do talks, as you can see. And I love to talk about it because I think it's important, but most probably on the scale of 1 to 10, it's not terribly important. But I do love to talk about it. And perhaps one day that memorial will actually be in place.
Thank you. And there's a question if you could tell a bit more about how the Abba Yudaya began practicing Judaism.
Yes. So as I understand it, and I was actually very anxious in the beginning with regards to making contact with the Abadaya. And then Rabbi Suzumu and I were on a program together in the Susan Mendes organization, because I felt that he would not be happy about my take on the origins of the Abadaya. But he actually embraced it, and I was very grateful to him for that. So, as I mentioned, Moshe Leviton, the father of Phil Leviton, was most probably the main person who educated Kakungulu way back when. And he most probably is the most responsible person for helping the Abadaya. As I understand it, the Abadaya already had, through their Lungfish tribe, already had various ceremonies around circumcision. So it was really easy to sort of transfer that over. And they also had dietary, I'm not thinking of the right word, dietary, I'm saying using the word restrictions, but that's not correct. And so it was easy for them. Yes, thank you. So it was easy for them to try to keep kosher or not keep kosher. But again, even for us, Ashkenazi Jews, we couldn't keep kosher because we didn't even have any kosher meat. And so, at Pesach and so on, people ate fruit and vegetables and milk products, perhaps, but no meat if that was their way, or mixed it all up. Because what else could you do? The cows walked, as you saw in that first one of those early paintings. The cows walked, and their meat was really tough. So you had to really cook that meat to make it tender. So but coming back to the Abadaya, they did it very carefully and very slowly. And as I mentioned also, in sort of gentle revolt against the British. That was sort of the aim of it originally, was to be different from the Christian or the Catholic or the Protestant, or maybe even the Muslim. And that's really essentially all I know.
Thank you. Marjorie, would you like to unmute and ask?
Yeah, just a quick question. The synagogue I was asking about is one that was towards the beginning of the talk, and it was elaborate, and it had a women's section. It looks more like a European synagogue. That's what I was trying to figure out what that was. So, and are all these pictures
the one in Eritrea, Janice, the one in Eritrea.
Is that what it is? Okay. Okay.
It was
I mean,
Italian
I'll let
synagogue.
Janice answer, but I think the first synagogue that Janice showed was the one in Eritrea where she was born. Right, Janice?
Yes, yes, that's correct. And that one was built in 1912. And now today there's just one Jew who looks after it called Sami Cohen. And he spends his time, because he has Italian citizenship, because if, remember, Eritrea used to be Italian before 1942. He spends his time between Rome, Israel, and Asmara. And his home is like a museum. We had Shabbat lunch there. And the only Jews at that time were the Israeli embassy and ourselves, my husband and I, and Sami Cohen, and one or two other guests. So we couldn't open the Torah. I'll tell you something else then about Eritrea. When my mother and father were there was a camp. Well, actually, it was like a prison, if you like, for Israelis who weren't called Israelis at that time, but the Ergan, etc., because they were getting too good and bothering the British too much, as you remember. So the British took them to Eritrea and put them in a camp. But you know what they did? They built tunnels with electric lights and would pop up in the library. And my mother would nod to them. And my mother has a whole piece in my book about how they got dressed up. And one is a police colonel, a policeman, and somebody else is a general. And they took the day off until they were recaptured. It was all very gentle and very easy. You know, they were just there to be kept out of the way. However, in Gilgil, which is in Kenya, near Nakuru, which is near Nairobi, there was another camp, again, for Ergan and so on people, and they dug a tunnel underneath. The Nakuru Jewish people had been bringing them challahs for Shabbat, and inside the challahs were things to dig with. And so they dug a tunnel underneath the fence, because, you know, the British who were looking after them, they would share cigarettes, they would play games together. It was all very gentle and very easy, but the idea was to keep them away from Palestine. And so there was a car waiting for them, whisked them away to an airplane, which took them to the Belgian Congo of the day, and then back to Palestine to continue fighting. And Danny Franco, the son of Victor Franco, believes that his father was a spy and was the person who planned it and had the plane waiting. There you are.
Thank you. So I think you partially answered this, but if you want to add anything to it, that why did your family leave to Africa from Palestine?
Why did they leave from Palestine to Africa? Because it was during the war, and the Germans were making good progress across the top of Africa, across North Africa. And my father was anxious. He had already escaped Germany once, and he didn't want to be caught again. There was another reason, in that my parents felt that perhaps they could earn more money in Eritrea. They wanted to have me, and they wanted to be more financially stable than they were. So that was the main reason.
And
but I don't think we really made. I don't think we were ever well off, as far as I remember.
And when did you leave Uganda?
My family left in 1961, and we emigrated to New Zealand. I did my postgraduate university training in New Zealand. I became a physiotherapist. I was on what we call walkabout. I planned to go to Israel on my way home. I wasn't allowed to go to the 67 war because I still owed a bursary to the New Zealand government, and they wouldn't let me out of the country. I think my parents engineered that. In hindsight, perhaps they were smart, I'm not sure, but I was very saddened at the time. And so I was now traveling around the world, and I got married here in Vancouver. And so here I am. I still have wonderful university friends in New Zealand, and we visit back and forth. And took many years, until 2001, actually, until my heart became Canadian. Took a very long time. I left it in New Zealand.
Thank you. So maybe your next book will be about the New Zealand Jewish community.
I don't think so. I'm not writing again, because as some of you might know, if you've ever tried to write, how difficult it is and how you have to really stick to it. And you can't really, I couldn't really see the whole picture. I never dreamt that this whole project would happen. I was just really writing an essay for my Simon Fraser University end of term project, and that was it. And this is what happened. So I guess my thought would be, if you're planning to write, don't ever give up. I did 24 drafts, full drafts for my book. And if I may say, I was very happy the other day. I gave a talk to a class at Simon Fraser University, and the prof had assigned 4 readings from my book to her students at university level, non-Jewish. And that, for me, made it worthwhile, the agony of writing. So stick to it if you also write as well as read books.
Thank you so much, Janice. So I think we went through most of the questions for sure. I don't know if Sebastian, you saw something that I missed. Hopefully we managed to ask everything that was written and asked. So thank you so much, Janice, again for sharing your story with us and for answering all these so many questions. And thank you all of you for being here and being active and asking all these questions. And we will share Janice's email address in tomorrow's follow-up email. So you will receive an email from us tomorrow, and we will include where you can get the book. We will include Janice's email address as well as this session's recording. So you will receive that tomorrow. And thank you all for being here today. This week, we will have 2 more sessions coming up. On Thursday, we will learn about the Jews of Prague, and on Sunday about the Jews of Cuba. So if you're interested in traveling on different continents with us and learning about other Jewish communities, then please check out our program. Of course, we will also include it in the follow-up email tomorrow. So thank you, everyone, and thank you, Janice, again. And if you want to add anything else that hasn't been said about your book or just in general, then please feel free.
I don't think I really have anything more. I think we've gone over time, and I appreciate you all hanging in, and thank you so much for coming. And I hope that you really enjoyed it. Thank
Janice, this is Irita Fisher in Victoria. Do
Hello.
you remember me from Shalom?
I do.
Yeah. How's your husband?
He's good. Thank you.
Okay, I'll email you when I get the address.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, this